Hello everybody. Isn't it nice to be back at a conference? Seeing the whites of your eyes. It's an absolute joy to be back and speaking after a very uncomfortable gap. Well, my talk is very different to the one before because I'm a medical microbiologist and have been so for 35 years or so. So I'm going to sort of dissect some of the science surrounding hospital cleaning. I've also got too many slides. I suspect I will be dragged off the podium at some stage, but let's get going and see how far we get. Okay. Well, I don't think that's been better illustrated than what's happened over the last 18 months, do you? Yeah. And the trouble is, the panic has made us do crazy things, and we've seen that through governments, through World Health Organization, through all sorts of statutory bodies. But we'll say more of that as time goes by. Well, I'm talking about cleaning. I need to define what cleaning is, because it's not disinfection. It's the removal of dirt, the physical removal of dirt. That's cleaning. So, okay, if you want to disinfect, that's fine. If you want to decontaminate, fine, and we've got antiseptics and all the rest of it. But cleaning is just simply removal of dirt. Now, I put this up here because I don't know how many of you have much to do with the clinical microbiology laboratory, and I wanted to make sure that you knew what some of our microbial criminals are. So I'm sure you've all heard of MRSA. You might not have heard of Acinetobacter, that's an environmental coliform. Clostridium difficile, I know you've heard of. VRE, vancomycin-resistant enterococcus. Norovirus, definitely. Coliforms, multi-drug resistant. And finally, you'll recognize the one at the bottom. The reason why I've shown this particular slide is just to show how long these organisms can survive in a temperate hospital climate on surfaces. Okay, and in fact, how small the infectious dose is. So you can probably work out yourself just how many people could be infected by norovirus from consecutive touching of one nurse call button. So this slide has changed. It used to be, it's all about hand touch sites. No, it's not. Not after the last 18 months. It's mostly about hand touch sites if we're talking about cleaning hard surfaces. But in actual fact, as you, I'm sure, know very well now, that the last pandemic virus was spreading through air, short-range aerosol. So it's not all about hand-touch sites, it's actually about the air as well. But I am going to concentrate on hand-touch sites because this was my remit for this particular talk. So they say that, in fact, patients get infections because doctors and nurses and clinical teams, etc., don't clean their hands at the right time, or they don't clean their hands enough, or they don't clean their hands at all. Well, possibly not. There is a role for patients in this, and patients who are conscious have two dual inoculators called hands, which touch the highest risk sites of all, which are the sites around the patient bed. A very nice little study there, you can see the graph there, showing that if you actually wash patients' hands or get them to clean their hands regularly, this is a group of about 50 patients in each group, they don't pick up multi-drug resistant organisms, and you can't find them on the nearby surfaces either. So, food for thought. How could you integrate some sort of patient hand cleaning system if you don't have one already? I'm sure your infection control team are aware of that. Here's the evidence that we've got, or some of it so far, to show that if you do concentrate on cleaning hand touch sites, and particularly closest to the patient, you do actually see a result in rates of hospital-acquired infection for some of the organisms that I've already detailed. And I particularly draw your attention to the REACH study, which is probably one of the most recent, whereupon a step wedge study across 11 Australian hospitals showed very nicely decreases in a couple of key pathogen rates there. And this was really about cleaning systems. It wasn't about what they were using. It was about educating the cleaners and infection control folk. So the hand-touch equation, which is one of my favourite slides, because so far all the attention has always seemed to be on hands and not on what hands touch. So all that emphasis on hand hygiene for staff, for patients, for visitors, and for all of us at home as well, particularly those of us looking after immunosuppressed patients in the community. It's actually also about what they touch, because the hands aren't a problem if they didn't touch something that was contaminated. So once again, how could your organisation change to encompass the risk from hand-touch sites? Well, what a pleasure to be able to show this after 20 years of talking about hospital cleaning and starting off by saying, well, actually, we don't have any evidence, but we know cleaning is good. Florence Nightingale said so. We have got evidence now. We've got quite a lot of evidence, and it's building all the time. And the last 18 months have accelerated our knowledge on hard surface cleaning. But we know that frequently touched sites are associated with microbial dirt, and that the more a site is touched, the greater the level of bioburden, and the more likely it is you're going to find a pathogen there. And we know that cleaning hand-touched sites does reduce the pathogens, and that that does have an impact on hospital-acquired infection rates. I couldn't have said any of this 20 years ago, or at least not much of it. So, but don't get too upset about all the scientific stuff that's going on, because at the end of the day, cleaning, the removal of dirt, is pretty basic. And I'm sure most of you clean your own homes if you don't have something to do with cleaning in the hospitals. And this particular paper from Jean-Yves Maillard and his colleagues, one wipe, one site, one direction, is really all you need to know about removal of microbial soil from high-risk sites. Of course, if it's not an outbreak, this is a routine cleaning situation. But of course, the direction can get a little bit complicated, so this is what you do. The S-shaped curve. And there is actually a paper that I've written with Axel Kramer, who is a German microbiologist now well into his 80s, who's been looking at hospital cleaning and organism survival and decontamination for years and years and years. And we thought we'd write a paper about the practical aspects of cleaning. And we didn't want to talk about terminal cleaning because those are always in the policies. We wanted to talk about cleaning when the patient's in the bed, because that's when they've got their hands moving about, touching things. And there's a pecking order. You start with the highest risk sites. You start with the sites furthest away from the door. You start high up and go low. And by the time you reach the door of the patient's room or the bed bay, you've covered everything. And I'm not including the ensuite in there as well. So I would commend this particular paper to you, because we've tried to evidence-base everything we've said in this paper about the practical way to clean the occupied bed space. But there are problems, as I'm sure you realise. And this scuppers everything. If there's MRSA on that table or around the bed, how do you know that you're going to be able to pick that up? Because there aren't many organisms in colony-forming units of these organisms needed to cause an infection. 4 on your average skin scale, which you can see glistening and floating about first thing in the morning when you get dressed in the morning and the sunshine's coming through. See those little things glistening? That's a skin scale. 4 colony-forming units of MRSA. And that's landed somewhere near a patient. How do you know that you're going to be able to clean that? So I would challenge you, because I don't know the answer to this. I've got some ideas, but I don't know the answer to this. How would you sort out cleaning clutter? Because these are the highest risk sites. Well, cleaning monitoring. Now, I know that most of it is visual, and that indeed is what we've already spoken about. But in fact, there are different things you can do. Some of these are more for research purposes, but you might want to establish what's going on in your organisation in a special study, which would then help you simplify how you're going to monitor what's going on. And you can walk around and look, fine, and I'll show you some justification for that in a moment. Certainly it ticks all the aesthetic boxes. You can also directly observe cleaners clean, very effective. Cleaners react immediately to that sort of observation. So you can also look at the cleaning process by putting fluorescent powder or gel or dye or whatever on a surface, and then you come back later on to see if it's been removed or substantially disrupted. So that's measuring cleaning. If you want to measure cleanliness of surfaces, though, then you can use microbiological methods. You can use ATP, which measures organic soil, and I'm sure some of you perhaps have already come across that. So microbiological standards, which are still proposed, although seem to have sort of immured themselves into the literature, a long time ago, in 2004, we put together some suggestions that more than 1 colony-forming unit of a pathogen per centimetre squared on a hand-touched site is not acceptable. Can't put 0, you get sued. It has to be less than 1. So what about the fact that if you actually do go screening the high-risk sites in hospitals, you don't necessarily find pathogens. They're quite few and far between. Even in the middle of an outbreak, very difficult to find the organism, I know. But what you do find is particularly if you use your dip slides or your graduated Rodat plates, is that you can get background environmental counts. And in actual fact, there's a link between the amount of bioburden you find and the presence or the possibility of finding a pathogen. The two standards are linked. So do they work? Well, lots of people have done some studies and they sort of work. It doesn't have to be 5, by the way. It could be 2.5. Some studies using 2.5 colony forming units per square centimetre. You might want to know what is a half of a colony forming unit. Come see me later. This one used 5, and we measured the bioburden around intensive care unit beds over 10 months and screened every month, thereabouts, counted up the number of organisms, so measured the bioburden. I think it was 5 sites around each bed. But we also, at the same time, were monitoring how many ITU-acquired staphylococcal infections, invasive infections, because Staph aureus, which I should have said earlier, and its resistant counterpart, MRSA, is absolutely the best indicator of hospital hygiene there is from a microbiological perspective. And you can see there we found a relationship. And in fact, you'll see the line going across there. That's the 5. That's the magic 5 colony forming units per square centimetre. Over time, we found that when the amount of bioburden was down, patients were less likely to get infection. This isn't the only study, I think there's about 4 or 5 now, showing that in actual fact, these standards, whether it's 2.5 or 5, do actually seem to equate with risk of acquiring an infection. Can work on that for the future. Right, well, this is a study from America, from my colleague, John Boyce. And what he did was he produced an algorithm looking at the fluorescent dye, how often is that removed, and if it's removed and when it's removed, what's the ATP level left, organic soil, what's the level of microbes left. And this one here is quite interesting because the top graph here shows you that you're more likely to get a good outcome microbiologically using the fluorescent powder, whereas this one down here, you're more likely to get a poor outcome from ATP when the fluorescent powder has not been removed. I always look for the extremes when I'm trying to understand a complicated graph. And I'll just summarize what that means. It means that if you want to know what surface need to be cleaned, use ATP, okay? Measure the organic soil. If you want to know how well a surface has been cleaned, you use the gold standard, which is microbiological, okay? They're both expensive. They're both not absolutely necessary for routine at the moment, but you might want to introduce them in specific circumstances. Now, these algorithms, there's plenty of them. You can find them in the literature. This is the most recent, and I had to show this one because it actually measures visual as well. And what it shows is that there's a weak correlation between organic soil measured by ATP and what it looks like. Now, isn't that useful? And the paper goes on to say, low-risk areas, visual is sufficient. I'd never thought I'd see anybody saying that in a paper and justifying it with scientific evidence. But that's really helpful. And as for your high-risk sites, observing the cleaners directly, cleaning, as well as some ATP intermittently, should be enough. Good way of doing it. Okay, of course, you can take it to the limit. Look what's happening now. These are very clever optical imaging equipment, which shows you invisible stains. And the stain that you can see here that flags up from this optical imagery, and this is from a handrest of a chair in an accident and emergency department, it did actually fail from the ATP level. I can't remember what the standard was. I think it was 100 ROUs. And it was I can't remember which particular type of ATP monitor it was either. But it doesn't tell you whether there's a pathogen there. It tells you that there's soil there. Yeah, organic soil, because the ATP is flashing. But it doesn't tell you if there's a pathogen there. And I'm not sure we're quite ready for this just yet. I think we have to decide what's allowed and what isn't, what's safe and what isn't. And the whole thing is going to be risk assessed depending on whether it's accident and emergency, operating theatre, critical care, or long-term care. It's all different. It's all about risk. So I think somebody might recognise this slide. I've lost count the number of times I've actually shown this particular slide. Very useful it is too. Basically shows you that top of a bedside locker begins to accumulate environmental flora after 3 hours. Well, big deal. That's what happens all the time. But note I say environmental flora, because I can recognise the colonies on those plates, and that possibly not a pathogen there, or certainly nothing that you would be concerned about. But having a look at this and thinking about frequency, with a lot of discussion about 10 years ago, so we decided to do this particular study, which was cleaning surfaces round a bed on a 30-bedded care of the elderly, acute care of the elderly ward. And we cleaned them with both detergent and with a disinfectant, a very good disinfectant, environmentally friendly as well. And it's over time, it's over 48 hours, and we measured what the bioburden was after we cleaned using these two different methods. And the blue one is the detergent, and the red one is the disinfectant. You can see that the impact on the bioburden straight down with the disinfectant, as you would expect, a bit slower, and not quite so far with the detergent cleaning. And this was with wipes, Tuffy wipe, Vernicare Tuffy wipes we used, and then we used the wipes, the same wipes with the disinfectant. And the cleaning was good, because I did it with one of my colleagues. And you can see that at 24 hours, okay, there's those differences in the first couple of hours, but at 24 hours, no significant difference. What does that tell you? Firstly, it says that if you clean the hand-touch sites around a patient's bed, and these were occupied beds, and you clean them well, you only need to do it once a day in the routine situation. It also tells you you don't necessarily need disinfectant. The plot will thicken. It's time to get physical when we're talking about cleaning, because that's not the only study that suggests that disinfectant is not always needed to remove microbial soil, even with Clostridium difficile. I don't have time to go into each of these papers, but here's some of the evidence to suggest that cleaning with disinfectant, if it's done correctly and it's done at the appropriate time, in the right way, is just as effective. And have a look at this as well, if we want to pull out the differences between detergent and disinfectant. Same study, over 48 hours, 130-bedded acute care of the elderly ward, and we're looking at detergent and we're looking at disinfectant. Same blue line is detergent, same red line is disinfectant. And this time we're not measuring total bioburden, we're measuring Staph aureus and MRSA. And you can see that whilst the detergent takes the level down of these pathogens on these near-patient hand-touch sites, there's this great big resurgence with the disinfectant, and we didn't know what was going on. This was a ward that had never really been exposed to disinfectant. So what was the answer? It was biofilm. The disinfectant is such a good disinfectant, it had stripped off the upper level of biofilm, which are like villages of microbes in a polysaccharide glue on hard surfaces, and also, in fact, some soft surfaces as well. You can get it on curtains and pillowcases. So we're pretty certain that what happened on this particular ward was because we cleaned well with a powerful disinfectant, it stripped off the surface and allowed organisms that have been buried in biofilm to come through and get picked up with the surface sampling afterwards. So you could produce some long-lost friends if you suddenly start cleaning with powerful disinfectants. Hard surface biofilm, well, this is going to run and run. It's now established at ECMID, which is the biggest infectious diseases conference that I go to. We've got biofilm groups, etc., etc. Does biofilm make a mockery of everything we do in the name of cleaning and disinfection? Is it going to scupper everything because we can never get rid of the organisms? Well, maybe, but this study, there's a little bit of light at the end of the tunnel, because this is 4 ITUs from the UK, and that was my own hospital, Saudi Arabia, Brazil, and Australia, and all those lovely colours show the different genus and species, the different types of organisms found from destructive sampling of little bits and pieces in all of these ITUs. And you can see that there's lots of red and there's lots of green. The reds tend to be gram-positive organisms, the green is Pseudomonas. And in the UK one, which is right at the end here, you see a whole block of yellow, those are environmental organisms, completely non-pathogenic. And there was a difference between my ITU and the others, and that was we cleaned routinely with detergent, all the hand-touch sites, 12 hourly, around the patient's bed. The other ITUs cleaned with disinfectants, and some very, very powerful disinfectants as well, and sometimes multiple. What does that mean? It means that routine exposure of your hospital environment to disinfectants affects your hospital microbiome, what's generally there. Think about a patient. You give a patient antibiotics and they get Clostridium difficile gastroenteritis. It's awful, because the antibiotics have taken out all the friendly bacteria in your gut and allowed certain organisms to proliferate and cause disease. It's the same thing with surfaces. You expose your hospital surfaces to powerful disinfectants on a regular basis, you bring up something which resists that, which could be nastier than what you were trying to get rid of in the first place. And we're not the only people to say that. I've been doing a lot of work on the International Space Station and found the same. So disinfect everything and get killed by the 0.000, whatever it is, organisms that are left. But in actual fact, those that are left are a lot more resistant. And there's just a possibility we're seeing some of this coming through now with the huge amount of disinfectant use because of the pandemic. Note I was talking about fear of a pandemic, fear of the unknown. So, well, the disinfectants I do have to talk about are hydrogen peroxide and UVC. And some of you perhaps have already utilised these in your hospitals, maybe as a response to an outbreak, maybe as a response to the pandemic. Hydrogen peroxide, aerosolised or gaseous, UVC, ultraviolet light in the C wavelength range. Very, very powerful decontaminating agents, and both packaged up neatly in nice little robots. So what are the problems? Those of you who've used them will already know. It takes time to get them sorted out. You have to take the patient out because they're toxic. You need to block all the air vents up. You have to reposition UVC because it only goes in one direction and then there's a corner. The light doesn't go around corners. You have to train staff, or you have to use the staff from the company that has sold them to you. You have to prepare the room because UVC won't get under bedclothes or through the folds of curtains, etc., etc. And there are health hazards. The UVC stinks of burning hair when you go into the room, quite apart from the fact that UVC does actually mutate environmental organisms that survive it. It actually knocks the strands of the DNA, which means that UVC used from these in this particular wavelength, and I can't speak for any other wavelength at the moment because we don't know, but there is a possibility that you're creating more pathogens or organisms that could cause trouble in the future. Are they any good? Well, yes, I mean, they obliterate everything, basically, so of course they're good. They will get rid of the organisms. But if you compare this, only one paper I've ever found which compares observed cleaning by cleaning staff versus UVC, and in actual fact, there's no difference. If you watch the cleaners clean, then they do as good a job as what the UVC robots do. And why is that important? It's cost, isn't it? Here's two studies, similar time, two quite similar hospitals, two similar ladies doing the studies. One used UVC to have an impact on their multi-drug resistant organism rate. The other banned cephalosporins and quinolones. And this was in the wake of Clostridium difficile. What did we find? Well, the American study found that they reduced their rate of hospital-acquired infection by 21%, and we reduced ours by nearly half. Our intervention cost $0. I have no idea what the American intervention cost, but it would have been a lot of money for these robots. So perhaps you need to branch out and make friends with your microbiologists. I'm sure many of you have relationships with your microbiologist in infection control, and say, let's talk about stewardship, which is rather a pompous term for cutting down on antibiotic use when it's not needed. After all, we are heading for the realms of untreatable organisms, and we're not just talking about pandemic virus either. So, nearly finished now. What do patients want then? What do they want in hospitals? And there were some lovely comments from Emma about patients and patients' view on what they think to the cleanliness and whether they know or they are assured that things are getting cleaned. Well, you can have a lady robot, and you can have a real lady cleaner there, and you can have a male robot, and you have a baby doing cleaning. That's what patients want. Not necessarily a lady, but somebody who's got enough time to talk to them and do little things for them and get to know the ward and stay on the same ward without being taken somewhere else. Ownership of a cleaner or a team of cleaners on a particular ward just works so well. There is nothing more infuriating than going back to your ward when someone else has been on it and finding your hoover in a right state, and I know because they tell me. So do we need powerful disinfectants to kill SARS too? No. It's an envelope virus. It's incredibly fragile. Even trying to swab it on surfaces, I found we disrupted it so that we could never grow it in culture. which is why it's been so difficult to show how it's transmitted. And I can assure you that surface is a very, very small part of transmission. At least we know that just over a year after this started. It's short-range aerosol. So all those awful television pictures of panic-stricken governments forcing people to spray the streets, absolute load of rubbish, which is why I suspect there will be a backlash amongst environmental organisms in the community as well in the hospitals. But I hope maybe that common sense will prevail for the future. So traditional cleaning, a la Florence Nightingale, the removal of dirt, it's effective, it's safe, it's cheap. Support your cleaners. Don't dream of automation and push-button gadgets that cost a great deal of money. They are not all they're cracked up to be. Saying that, though, in the event of an overwhelming outbreak, I'm very glad we have them. And I think I'll leave the last word to William Osler, who was a consultant physician in America 100 years ago, and he said, soap and water and common sense are the best disinfectants. So thank you very much indeed for your attention.